Okay, good morning everyone. So we're going to continue with our tutor reading today. So if you turn to chapter 67, and that's page 45 from where we left off last time. If you've got a book, you might want to grab a ruler just so that you can follow along. Chapter 67. The next day was Saturday, and there's not much to do on a Saturday unless Father takes me out somewhere on an outing to the boating lake or to the garden centre. But on this Saturday, England were playing Romania at football, which meant that we weren't going to go on an outing because Father wanted to watch the match on the television. So I decided to do some more detection on my own. I decided that I would go and ask some of the other people who lived in our street if they had seen anyone killing Wellington, or whether they had seen anything strange happening in the street on Thursday night. Talking to strangers is not something I usually do. I do not like talking to strangers. This is not because of stranger danger, which they tell us about at school, which is where a strange man offers you sweets or a ride in his car because he wants to do sex with you. I'm not worried about that. If a strange man touched me, I would hit him, and I can hit people very hard. For example, when I punched Sarah because she pulled my hair, I knocked her unconscious and she had a concussion and they had to take her to the accident and emergency department at hospital. And also, I always have my Swiss Army knife in my pocket, and it has a saw blade which could cut a man's fingers off. I do not like strangers because I do not like people I have never met before. They are hard to understand. It's like being in France, which is where we went on holiday sometimes when Mother was alive to camp. And I hated it because if you went in a shop, or a restaurant, or on a beach, you couldn't understand what anyone was saying, which was frightening. It takes me a long time to get used to people I do not know. For example, when there is a new member of staff at school, I do not talk to them for weeks and weeks. I just watch them until I know that they are safe. Then I ask them questions about themselves, like whether they have pets, and what is their favourite colour, and what do they know about the Apollo space missions, and I get them to draw a plan of their house, and I ask them what kind of car they drive so that I get to know them. Then I don't mind if I'm in the same room as them, and don't have to watch them all the time. So talking to other people in our street was brave. But if you're going to do detective work, you have to be brave, so I had no choice. First of all, I made a plan of our part of the street, which is called Randolph Street, like this. Then I made sure I had my Swiss Army knife in my pocket and went out and I knocked on the door of number 40, which is opposite Mrs. Shear's house, which means that they were most likely to have seen something. The people who live at number 40 are called Thompson. Mr. Thompson answered the door. He was wearing a t-shirt which said, "Beer. Helping ugly people have sex for 2,000 years. Mr. Thompson said, "Can I help you?" I said, "Do you know who killed Wellington?" I did not look at his face. I do not like looking at people's faces, especially if they are strangers. He did not say anything for a few seconds. Then he said, "Who are you?" I said, "I'm Christopher Boone from number 36 and I know you. You're Mr. Thompson." He said, "I'm Mr. Thompson's brother." I said, "Well, do you know who killed Wellington?" He said, "Who's Wellington?" I said, "Mrs. Shear's dog. Mrs. Shear's is from number 41. He said, "Someone killed her dog." I said, "With a fork." He said, "Jesus Christ." I said, "A garden fork," in case he thought I meant a fork you eat your food with. Then I said, "Do you know who killed him?" He said, "I haven't a bloody clue." I said, "Did you see anything suspicious on Thursday evening?" He said, "Look, son, do you really think you should be going around asking questions like this?" And I said, "Yes, because I want to find out who killed Wellington and I'm writing a book about it." And he said, "Well, I was in Colchester on Thursday, so you're asking the wrong bloke." I said, "Thank you," and walked away. There was no answer at house number 42. I had seen the people who lived at number 44, but I did not know what their names were. They were black people, and they were a man and a lady with 2 children, a boy and a girl. The lady answered the door. She was wearing boots which looked like army boots, and there were 5 bracelets made out of silver-coloured metal on her wrist, and they made a jangling noise. She said, "It's Christopher, isn't it?" I said that it was, and I asked her if she knew who killed Wellington. She knew who Wellington was, so I didn't have to explain, and she had heard about him being killed. I asked if she had seen anything suspicious on Thursday evening which might be a clue. She said, "Like what?" And I said, "Like strangers, or like the sound of people arguing." But she said she hadn't. And then I decided to do what is called trying a different tack. And I asked her whether she knew of anyone who might want to make Mrs. Shears sad. And she said, "Perhaps you should be talking to your father about this." And I explained that I couldn't ask my father because the investigation was a secret, because he had told me to stay out of other people's business. She said, "Well, maybe he has a point, Christopher." And I said, "So you don't know anything which might be a clue?" And she said, "No." And then she said, "You be careful, young man." I said that I would be careful, and then I said thank you to her for helping me with my questions, and I went to number 43, which is the house next to Mrs. Shears' house. The people who live at number 43 are Mr. Wise and Mr. Wise's mother, who is in a wheelchair, which is why he lives with her, so he can take her to the shops and drive her around. It was Mr. Wise who answered the door. He smelt of body odour and old biscuits and off popcorn, which is what you smell of if you haven't washed for a very long time, like Jason at school smells because his family is poor. I asked Mr. Wise if he knew who had killed Wellington on Thursday night. He said, "Bloody hell, policemen really are getting younger, aren't they?" Then he laughed. I do not like people laughing at me, so I turned and walked away. I did not knock at the door of number 38, which is the house next to our house, because the people there take drugs, and father says I should never talk to them, so I don't. And they play loud music at night, and they make me scared sometimes when I see them in the street, and it's not really their house. Then I noticed that the old lady who lives at number 39, which is on the other side of Mrs. Shears' house, was in her front garden, cutting her hedge with an electric hedge trimmer. Her name is Mrs. Alexander. She has a dog. It is a dachshund, so she was probably a good person because she liked dogs. But the dog wasn't in the garden with her, it was inside the house. Mrs. Alexander was wearing jeans and training shoes which old people don't normally wear. There was mud on her jeans, and the trainers were New Balance trainers, and the laces were red. I went up to Mrs. Alexander and said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" Then she turned the electric hedge trimmer off and said, "I'm afraid you're going to have to say that again. I'm a little deaf." So I said, "Do you know anything about Wellington being killed?" And she said, "I heard about it yesterday. Oh, dreadful, dreadful." I said, "Do you know who killed him?" And she said, "No, I don't." I replied, "Well, somebody must know, because the person who killed Wellington knows that they killed Wellington, unless they were a mad person and didn't know what they were doing, or unless they had amnesia." And she said, "Well, I suppose you're probably right." I said, "Thank you for helping me with my investigation." And she said, "You're Christopher, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I live at number 36. And she said, "We haven't talked before, have we?" I said, "No, I don't like talking to strangers, but I'm doing detective work." And she said, "I see you every day, going to school." I didn't reply to this. And she said, "It's very nice of you to come and say hello." I didn't reply to this either, because Mrs. Alexander was doing what is called chatting, where people say things to each other which aren't questions and answers and aren't connected. Then she said, "Even if it's only because you were doing detective work." And I said, "Thank you," again. And I was about to turn and walk away when she said, "I have a grandson your age." I tried to do chatting by saying, "My age is 15 years and 3 months and 3 days. And she said, "Well, almost your age." Then we said nothing for a little while until she said, "You don't have a dog, do you?" And I said, no. She said, you'd probably like a dog, wouldn't you? And I said, I have a rat. And she said, a rat? And I said, he's called Toby. And she said, oh. And I said, most people don't like rats because they think they carry diseases like bubonic plague. That's only because they lived in sewers and stowed away on ships coming from foreign countries where there are strange diseases. But rats are very clean. Toby is always washing himself, and you don't have to take him out for walks. I just let him run around my room so that he gets some exercise. And sometimes he sits on my shoulder or hides in my sleeve like it's a burrow, but rats don't live in burrows in nature. Mrs. Alexander said, do you want to come in for some tea? And I said, I don't go into other people's houses. And she said, well, maybe I could bring some out here. Do you like lemon squash? I replied, I only like orange squash. And she said, luckily I have some of that as well. What about Battenberg? And I said, I don't know because I don't know what Battenberg is. She said, it's a kind of cake. It has 4 pink and yellow squares in the middle, and it has a marzipan icing round the edge. And I said, is it a long cake with a square cross section which is divided into equally sized, alternately coloured squares? And she said, yes, I think you could probably describe it like that. I said, I think I'd like the pink squares but not the yellow squares because I don't like yellow. And I don't know what marzipan is, so I don't know whether I'd like that. And she said, I'm afraid marzipan's yellow too. Perhaps I should bring out some biscuits instead. Do you like the biscuits? And I said, yes, some sorts of biscuits. She said, I'll get a selection. Then she turned and went into the house. She moved very slowly because she was an old lady, and she was inside the house for more than 6 minutes, and I began to get nervous because I didn't know what she was doing in the house. I didn't know her well enough to know whether she was telling the truth about getting orange squash and Battenberg cake. I thought she might be ringing the police, and then I'd get into much more serious trouble because of the caution. So I walked away. And as I was crossing the street, I had a stroke of inspiration about who might have killed Wellington. I was imagining a chain of reasoning inside my head, which was like this. 1. Why would you kill a dog? A. Because you hated the dog. B. Because you were mad. C. Because you wanted to make Mrs. Shears upset. Number 2. I didn't know anyone who hated Wellington, so if it was A, it was probably a stranger. Number 3. I didn't know any mad people, so if it was B, it was also probably a stranger. Number 4. Most murders are committed by someone who is known to the victim. In fact, you are most likely to be murdered by a member of your own family on Christmas Day. This is a fact. Wellington was therefore most likely to have been killed by someone known to him. Number 5. If it was C, I only knew one person who didn't like Mrs. Shears, and that was Mr. Shears, who knew Wellington very well indeed. This meant Mr. Shears was my prime suspect. Mr. Shears used to be married to Mrs. Shears, and they lived together until 2 years ago. Then Mr. Shears left and didn't come back. This was why Mrs. Shears came over and did lots of cooking for us after Mother died, because she didn't have to cook for Mr. Shears anymore, and she didn't have to stay at home and be his wife. And also, Father said that she needed the company and didn't want to be on her own. And sometimes Mrs. Shears stayed overnight at our house, and I liked it when she did because she made things tidy, and she arranged the jars and pans and tins in order of their height on the shelves in the kitchen. She always made their labels face outwards, and she put the knives and forks and spoons in the correct compartments in the cutlery drawer. But she smoked cigarettes. She said lots of things I didn't understand, e.g., I'm going to hit the hay, and it's brass monkeys out there, and let's rustle up some tucker. And I didn't like it when she said things like that because I didn't know what she meant. And I don't know why Mr. Shears left Mrs. Shears because nobody told me. But when you get married, it is because you want to live together and have children. And if you get married in a church, you have to promise that you will stay together until death do us part. And if you don't want to live together, you have to get divorced. And this is because one of you has done sex with somebody else, or because you are having arguments and you hate each other, and you don't want to live in the same house anymore and have children. And Mr. Shears didn't want to live in the same house as Mrs. Shears anymore, so he probably hated her, and he might have come back and killed her dog to make her sad. I decided to try and find out more about Mr. Shears. Chapter 71. All the other children at my school are stupid. Except I'm not meant to call them stupid, even though this is what they are. I'm meant to say that they have learning difficulties or they have special needs. But this is stupid because everyone has learning difficulties, because learning to speak French or understanding relativity is difficult. And also, everyone has special needs, like Father, who has to carry a little packet of artificial sweetening tablets around with him to put in his coffee to stop him getting fat. Or Mrs. Peters, who wears a beige-coloured hearing aid, or Siobhan, who has glasses so thick that they give you a headache if you borrow them. And none of these people are special needs, even if they have special needs. But Siobhan said we have to use those words, because people used to call children like the children at school spaz and crip and mong, which were nasty words. But that is stupid too, because sometimes the children from the school down the road see us in the street when we're getting off the bus, and they shout, "Special needs! Special needs!" But I don't take any notice because I don't listen to what other people say, and only sticks and stones can break my bones, and I have a Swiss Army knife if they hit me, and if I kill them it will be self-defence and I won't go to prison. I'm going to prove that I'm not stupid. Next month I'm going to take my A-level in maths and I'm going to get an A grade. No one has ever taken an A-level at our school before, and the headmistress, Mrs. Gascoigne, didn't want me to take it at first. She said they didn't have the facilities to let us sit A-levels. But Father had an argument with Mrs. Gascoigne and he got really cross. Mrs. Gascoigne said they didn't want to treat me differently from everyone else in the school, because then everyone would want to be treated differently and it would set a precedent. And I could always do my A-levels later, at 18. I was sitting in Mrs. Gascoigne's office with Father when she said these things, and Father said, "Christopher is getting a rubbish enough deal already, don't you think? Jesus, this is the one thing he's really good at." Then Mrs. Gascoigne said that she and Father should talk about this at some later point on their own. But Father asked her whether she wanted to say things that she was embarrassed to say in front of me, and she said no, so he said, "Say them now then." And she said that if I sat an A-level, I would have to have a member of staff looking after me on my own in a separate room. And Father said he would pay someone £50 to do it after school, and he wasn't going to take no for an answer. And she said she'd go away and think about it. And the next week she rang Father at home and told him that I could take the A-level and the Reverend Peters would be what is called the invigilator. And after I've taken A-level maths, I'm going to take A-level further maths and physics, and then I can go to university. There's not a university in our town, which is Swindon, because it is a small place. So we will have to move to another town where there is a university, because I don't want to live on my own or in a house with other students. But that will be all right, because Father wants to move to a different town as well. He sometimes says things like, "We've got to get out of this town, kiddo." Then, when I've got a degree in maths or physics, or maths and physics, I'll be able to get a job and earn lots of money, and I will be able to pay someone who can look after me and cook my meals and wash my clothes. Or I will get a lady to marry me and be my wife, and she can look after me so I can have company and not be on my own. Chapter 73. I used to think that my mother and father might get divorced. That was because they had lots of arguments, and sometimes they hated each other. This was because of the stress of looking after someone who has behavioural problems like I have. I used to have lots of behavioural problems, but I don't have so many now because I'm more grown up and I can take decisions for myself and do things on my own, like going out of the house and buying things at the shop at the end of the road. These are some of my behavioural problems. A. Not talking to people for a long time. Once, I didn't talk to anyone for 5 weeks. B. Not eating or drinking for a long time. When I was 6, Mother used to get me to drink strawberry-flavoured slimming meals out of a measuring jug, We would have competitions to see how fast I could drink a quarter of a litre. Number C. Not liking being touched. D. Screaming when I'm angry or confused. E. Not liking being in really small spaces with other people. F. Smashing things when I'm angry or confused. G. Groaning. H. Not liking yellow things or brown things and refusing to touch yellow things or brown things. I. Refusing to use my toothbrush if anybody else has touched it. J. Not eating food if different sorts of food are touching each other. K. Not noticing that people are angry with me. L. Not smiling. M. Saying things that other people think are rude. People say that you always have to tell the truth, but they do not mean this, because you are not allowed to tell old people that they are old, and you are not allowed to tell people if they smell funny or if a grown-up has made a fart. And you are not allowed to say, I don't like you, unless that person has been horrible to you. N. Doing stupid things. Stupid things are things like emptying a jar of peanut butter onto the table in the kitchen and making it level with a knife so it covers all the table right to the edges, or burning things on the gas stove to see what happened to them, like my shoes or silver foil or sugar. O. Hitting other people. P. Hating France. Q. Driving mother's car. I only did this once by borrowing the keys when she went into town on the bus, and I hadn't driven a car before, and I was 8 years old and 5 months, so I drove it into the wall, and the car isn't there anymore because mother is dead. R. Getting cross when someone has moved the furniture. It is permitted to move the chairs and the table in the kitchen because that is different, but it makes me dizzy and sick if someone has moved the sofa and the chairs around in the living room or the dining room. Mother used to do this when she did the hoovering, so I made a special plan of where all the furniture was meant to be and did measurements and put everything back in its proper place afterwards, and then I felt better. But since mother died, father hasn't done any hoovering, so that is okay. And Mrs. Shears did the hoovering once, but I did groaning and she shouted at father and she never did it again. Sometimes these things would make mother and father really angry, and they would shout at me, or they would shout at each other. Sometimes father would say, Christopher, if you do not behave, I swear I shall knock the living daylights out of you. Or mother would say, Jesus, Christopher, I'm seriously considering putting you in a home. Or mother would say, you are going to drive me to an early grave. Okay, so that's the end of our reading today. Really well done for following along. Sorry for some of the word vomit and mistakes there. Hope you have a lovely day, everyone.